Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, and I'm so excited to be speaking with Bonny Reichert today. And she is the author of How to Share an Egg, a true story of hunger, love, and plenty. And before we get into it with Bonny, I want to tell you a little bit about her. She's a National Magazine Award-winning journalist. She has been an editor at Today's Parent and Chatelaine magazines, and a columnist and regular contributor to the Globe and Mail newspaper. When she turned 40, a now or never feeling made her quit her job to enroll in culinary school, and she's been exploring her relationship with food on the page ever since. Bonny was born in Edmonton, Alberta, and lives in Toronto with her husband and little dog, Bruno. How to Share an Egg won the 2022 Dave Greber Book Award for social justice writing. And it's so great to have you on the program, Bonny.
It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm thrilled.
Let's talk about this book, because this book covers so much. Maybe you can talk about what it's about from your perspective, and then I'm going to get into my thoughts about what is so compelling about it.
Well, I think I did squish a few different kinds of memoirs into one. I didn't realize I was doing that. I just wrote what I had. I think of it as a memoir wrapped around a family story. And the family story is my father's survival of the Holocaust and his incredible resilience and even his joy or wonder. I talk about it as wonder in one chapter, at finding himself a survivor and starting a new life. And growing up with that joy and wonder was a really unique way to grow up, particularly for a child of a Holocaust survivor. So I was motivated to illustrate that, because I think that when people hear Holocaust survivor family, they imagine extreme trauma, and there is trauma, we can talk about that, but a different flavor, pardon the pun, of trauma from what I experienced, what I would say that we have, and they don't imagine a family like ours. So I really wanted to explore that on the page. I also wanted to write a food memoir because I'm a food writer. This is my background from after going to chef school. I've worked only in food writing for the last 15 years. And food is a constant and has been a constant in my life. So my father almost starved in the Lodge Ghetto and in the camps after that and on death marches. Then he comes to Edmonton, and what job does he find himself in but in the restaurant business? At 20, he buys a restaurant that becomes his business. He buys and sells restaurants throughout my childhood, and food is just a huge part. And then at 40, I end up going to chef school. So I knew that food was this through line, and I wanted to combine these two things.
That's a great description of it, as food is the through line, and it's memoir wrapped around a family story, which is based on a very important and serious event in history, which is the Holocaust. And I had a guest on my program, Joanna Rakoff, who said that the best memoir reads like a novel. And it really does, because you start in an inciting incident from your dad's history. and wrapped around the title, How to Share an Egg. It's based on that. Even though we're going along your coming of age story as well as you dealing with the impact of, as you call it, and as it's so aptly described, intergenerational trauma, which anybody like myself who has a parent who survived the Holocaust in Europe understands, and also people who dealt with October 7th in a different way realize that intergenerational trauma comes everywhere.
Something that was really important to me is that I wanted the book to sort of reach beyond. It's a very Jewish book, but I wanted the book to be universal, the themes and the journey in the book to be universal, that somebody coming from any background would relate to it. Memoir writers know, we know that somehow the more specific you are, the more universal the story becomes. It's one of those funny paradoxes. I thought about that constantly. And, you use the self to go beyond the self. So it's about me, but only as a tool to be about the reader. And I've had amazing feedback from people from all kinds of different backgrounds who have trauma in their history for different reasons, who have connected with the book. And that is amazing. That is so much what I wanted.
It feels very universal. It feels like a coming of age story. It feels like, you're dealing with a lot of transitions all throughout the book. And the Holocaust story is an underlying element of it. And of course, it's a Jewish family, but the ending is even like climactic. It has a big revelation about what happened during the war and your dad's part and how he brought that forth or held that in. And I don't want to give that whole thing away, but it really reads like a novel. And the memoir part of it is very relatable. So many people have issues with relationships, with marriage, who have been divorced, who have had career dilemmas that they're trying to figure out their purpose. And so you do this and you wrap it in beautiful language. So I have a lot of questions to ask about how you structured the book, because like you said, there's so many disparate elements. It almost feels like you could have written your food part separate, my career in food and how I decided to go to chef training school, and your other parts separate. Did you write it in a linear fashion? And then the family history could have been a separate thing also. And of course, that was informed as you learned more about what you wanted to write about your family. How did that all happen?
It's interesting, when people say that, questions like that, because the way that it happened actually was that I had a vision from the beginning that every chapter would be about a food. And the project changed and morphed. At the beginning, it was going to have recipes. It was going to be not lighter, but the narrative drive of the story came a little later. And at first, it was going to be every chapter was named a food, and many still are. So you can see the skeleton of that. I put myself on a very strict plan. It was really hard what I decided to do. So that's the way I structured it at first. Every chapter was named after a food. I had to come up with a food story that fit chronologically. Then my editor and I decided that each chapter should have one punch, and mine had multiple punches. So I was left with how to solve that. She was very hands-off in the most wonderful way and did not tell me how to solve it. My choice to solve it was to make the chapters very short.
How many chapters in the book?
56 maybe. Once I shortened the chapters, I had a lot more flexibility. Further, I gave up on every single chapter having to have a food story and a food name. We decided, Sarah and I, that each chapter should be about one thing. And so in my mind, I had to be able to articulate it in a sentence, right? Sort of like a TV series where there's a big arc, but then
Yes.
each episode is about something. So I used that metaphor or that model, and I thought about it that way. And I think that that's what gives the book its propulsive quality, those short chapters. Nobody would tell me. I kept asking, my editor, my agent. I was finishing an MFA when I started the book. How long should the chapters be? And of course, no one will tell you that, because who knows? Who knows, right?
So how many words approximately is it per chapter?
They're short. I don't know. They're 1,200 maybe, 1,500, sometimes even shorter. But originally they were 4,000 words, the chapters. I was structuring the chapters by amount of time. I want to cover this much time, this much time. And then when I started to do it, they are chronological. They follow a narrative arc. But when I started to do it by theme, what's this chapter about? What's this chapter about? The work changed. I looked at other memoirs, and I knew starting in childhood is not an exciting way to start a book. I knew I wanted a scene from late in the book as my opening. The foreword I wrote later, the foreword that's about the title and what how to share an egg means, that I wrote at the end. But I found a scene from a high point in the narrative and I put it at the beginning, and then I just worked forward. And then when I catch up with that scene, which I knew had to be not too late, and I had to do quite a bit of trimming in the first third of the book to make that happen not too late. And then I change from past tense to present tense, and then onward. Then it starts to sort of gallop, right? It starts to move fast.
So it's interesting that you use the word propulsive. And I did get the feel there's like a lot of movement in this book, and that's what makes it exciting. I think that's also your background as a magazine editor.
It might be. You just don't know. You can set the table beautifully for your guest, but you don't know if they're going to have the experience that you want them to have. I mean, I'm not shocked, but it's interesting. But I do know how to end in a way that wants you to keep reading, because yes, that is my background. You're right.
Yeah.
And also the title and the subtitle come directly from my training as a magazine editor, where, I've got a head and a deck. Those are the exact title and subtitle that I gave it from the very beginning. And in fact, that name, How to Share an Egg, was the thread we haven't talked about, is my dad wanting me to write his story and the book not being the book that he wanted me to write. But when I was young, that was the name that the book would have, How to Share an Egg. And so it is.
Now, for some reason, and I know that you start in a family trip in Warsaw, but for some reason, I thought his story about the egg was earlier in the book, but it's not actually.
It's in the foreword. He never tells it in the book. It's from the childhood stories that I knew. So it's where I start in the foreword.
Yes, which to me is like the inciting incident. And then you get into this trip that was important. It's interesting to me that you're talking about these two starving boys and what happens with the egg. And then we get into part one, Warsaw, 2015. It's labeled Borscht for that chapter. And you start with, "We are starving."
Yes, that was very intentional. A simple declarative sentence about the journey you're about to go on.
Yeah, that is just very powerful. How long did it take you to write this? I know your dad, your whole life he wanted you to write his story.
I didn't attempt it for years and years and years and years. I sidestepped, I avoided, I obfuscated. The actual writing took about 4.5 years, including gaps to wait for my editor and editing. So the writing and editing took about 4.5 years. So I sold the book on proposal. I have a great agent, and she was fairly aggressive with it. And we sold it based on a very detailed proposal and a couple of sample chapters. So when I say 4.5 years, I'm including the time that it took me to write that proposal and those sample chapters. And then we sold it. I worked for 18 months to complete a first draft. That went in. And then my editor at the publisher, we did 3 drafts.
And how different was it in the ending of what you actually submitted from the actual, what you said it was going to be in the proposal?
The first draft was not that different. I didn't completely understand the task of creating a narrative arc when I wrote the proposal. I faked it well enough that my agent thought I understood. I wrote something about this for Jane Friedman. I faked it well enough. I knew what it was, but I didn't know what I was going to have to do to get there. So to answer your question, there was more of a narrative arc in the draft than the plan, in the chapter summaries. But I guess only I knew that because Michelle believed that I knew what I was doing. And then in the editing that went on after that, we honed that. There's 2 little sections on either end of the book and then 3 big sections inside. And the first section was too long, and the second section was too sort of prosaic. And the last section was almost perfectly formed from the beginning. which is interesting. I knew what had to go with the last section, and it barely changed between the 3 drafts. The first section I had to tighten up. There was too much detail about childhood and things like that. The middle section was the section that I worked really hard on. Reverse outlining was a very useful tool for me to figure out what each chapter wasn't just saying, but doing. I say this all the time. It was like a bridge, a starting here that was really firmly rooted and an ending here that was firmly rooted. And the middle started to feel very rickety. So I took the whole middle off. I took the bridge off and I looked at what each section was doing. And then I moved things around and grouped them thematically. And it got much, much better. I think I've got a chapter called Lost. I use that chapter to talk about my existential crisis. So I talk about trauma here, and I use the word trauma very infrequently in the book, but I do that here. And I use a little incident with a therapist to sort of explore trauma, which is thematically really important. So there were different parts like that. So you have to find an incident or a conversation or an experience that allows you to talk thematically.
I love that. So if you're struggling, take the pieces, the disparate pieces, like in the middle or whatever, and then see if there are different themes or through lines you can wrap it around.
You take a piece of paper and you write for each chapter, or you can even do it within a chapter, but I did it by chapter. What is it saying? What is it doing within the surface level of the story? But what is it doing? So when I reverse outlined what I had, the emotional journey was like this. There was no curve to it. It was good, bad, okay, not okay. And it didn't have emotional resonance because it was too zigzaggy. So I had to group like things. This chapter called Writer's Block, chapter 37, really important chapter that almost didn't exist until the 3rd draft. If I'm going to talk about writer's block, you have to place it in time, in the timeline of the book. But then you can leave the timeline and talk about, what gives a person a 40-year case of writer's block. Just starting to kind of meditate on a theme, right? So Mom and I threw out my work when I was 9, planting a seed of self-doubt. But on its own, I don't know that that one act would be powerful enough to plague me into adulthood. But the Holocaust and the book. I honestly can't say how many times Dad suggested I might want to write his story. Many times, once in a while, only a few. So I've completely left, the here and now for a little while, just to meditate on this theme of writer's block and the Holocaust and my dad wanting me to create this work and me not being able to create the work because it was too much pressure. And then I go back. I wasn't really doing that before. You can leave the moment that you're in for a little while and then come back to it. It's essential in memoir.
And you also tied into something that you said on page 87, coping was about containment, which I feel is like kind of a through line, even with the food experiences that you had. I mean, I know cooking is about rules, right? But it gave you a certain freedom. I'm thinking about the parish chapter with all these really tough teachers. Can you speak to that?
I mean, coping is about containment, is about the Holocaust. I wanted to keep that in a very small box so that it wouldn't, the sadness and the trauma, the tragedy wouldn't take over my life. So that's what that's about. The food and creativity are almost the antidote to that sadness. I was a very creative kid, but I didn't know I was. And I didn't express my creativity freely. It's not like it's, oh, whoa, whoa, poor me. I had a lovely childhood. I knew myself from the inside, but I didn't look at myself from the outside and say, oh, I'm a creative person. I need to do this, this, and this. So I found my way into that. The cooking was very natural, and I didn't think of it as creative. It was like being able to walk or being able to speak. It was very normal in our house. But looking back, I see that that was, of course, a form of creativity. And then the writing. That's what that writer's block chapter is about, being able to really open up and express what I had inside at a level that I never thought I would be able to do. First, because I didn't know how to put it into words. And second, because I always thought nobody will understand. So this is really amazing to have this book out. And I'm sure many people feel like this because people do seem to understand. So it's great.
So I want to talk about some of the beautiful metaphors you use throughout the book. On page 144, you say, when I got home from the office, the kids were at school and everything around the house felt unnaturally quiet, like when you leave a loud concert and the silence has its own sound. Michael, who'd listened to me worry and rehearse my quitting speech to death, was kind and gentle. My parents were, of course, thrilled. Oh, thank God, Mom said over the phone. Now you will finally relax, said Dad. His love and protection were like a heavy blanket on top of me. It was almost impossible to move under the weight. Now, that's a beautiful metaphor, and it's also a theme. It's a theme that runs through your memoir.
I mean, you can have someone that wants too much for you. And so it is like this blanket that is cozy and keeps you warm and keeps you safe, but is heavy to move under. And sometimes that kind of language comes easily. Sometimes you're overworking it and it's time to put it away. It's not working. And the more you work it, the worse it's going to get. But when they come easily like that, why not put it in? Because it just seemed exactly right.
And that was an underlying thread. Your dad, because of what he had gone through, he was hyper vigilant, hyper protective of you.
Yes, so protective. It wasn't the kind of protective where he's afraid for me to leave the house. It wasn't like that. It was more that he just wanted my sisters and me to be happy all the time. He wanted to see joy. He felt that he had suffered enough, for generations, and that his family should have joy and happiness and safety and security. And these are wonderful things for him to want to give. But it's not always possible to be happy. And how do you even know that your life matters if you're supposed to be happy all the time? So this is, I would say, the way that the intergenerational trauma was expressed or has been expressed in our family. It's his need to insulate, emotionally insulate. And at least for me, my sisters might feel a little differently. We're similar, but I never speak for them. But for me, this became a little bit oppressive, this need to be happy all the time. So the very ordinary struggles that I went through, which you mentioned, a divorce, being a single parent of a young child, career struggles, ordinary things. But when you have a parent who doesn't want you to take risks and doesn't want you to spend a day unhappy, you lose the opportunity to fail and build up your self-esteem and really come to see yourself as strong. I can do hard things.
Yeah, I like that. And that was a thread also. I can do hard things, that you constantly pushed yourself. You were somebody, though, it's interesting. Maybe it's how you embodied the joy that your dad and your mom wanted you to feel, because you constantly strove to try new things, new aspects of yourself. And sometimes you had to be pushed and pulled to it. And sometimes you got there through depression and getting through depression. And you talk very frankly about all that. This is another metaphor that I thought was great. On page 128, you had like an old floor that you were refurbishing. And so you said, "Oh no," said the clerk when I described what I was doing. "You can't just stick them on top. You have to get the old floor off first. You have to scrape." He pulled a tool off the rack and handed it to me. I scraped at that floor for days, for weeks. The old tiles came off in fragments and chunks and ribbons. In some places, there were pieces of another floor under that. I worked into the night, scraping back the years, the mistakes, the layers. I wanted to get to the point where there would be nothing left to remove, where the ground would be smooth and solid and true beneath my feet. So we're talking about a floor, but we're talking about you.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because that's like a really extended metaphor. And I knew that I wanted this thing about the floor and the scraping of the floor during this time that was really rock bottom for me. I knew I wanted it in there. My wonderful editor said, "I don't get it. I don't get it." I was being too subtle. We were going through and she was saying, "I'm not sure you need this. I'm not sure." I said, "No, I need it." And so I had to be more and more overt, because if there's one thing that my writing is, it can be a little subtle. So that last paragraph, I thought the metaphor was obvious, but it was subtle. And my editor pushed me, and that last paragraph brings it home after, a half a chapter about this floor that really, it was a metaphor in the moment. I didn't just make it a metaphor to write about it. Of course, it didn't solidify until I got it on the page.
Yeah, no, it's really beautiful because you're going through your own journey, but you're also using words and painting pictures with your words so that the reader can also understand on several layers. There's the stories, there's what's happening with you, and then the words, which are the underpinning of it. I had a question for you. So there was one that I would love for you to explain a little bit more about. When you were in Toronto, this was Jeff, who was your first husband.
Yes.
This is the ending of the chapter that talks about your date, your very pivotal date with him. So you say, I don't remember if we had a salad or if there was dessert, but crystal clear is that bottle of wine and the way he pretended he didn't know if he had wine or not. I'll check, he said, getting up from the little table by the window. When he came back, it was as if the wine had been just kicking around. Oh, I have a bottle after all, he said, applying a corkscrew. It was much later when he admitted that he had gone out and bought the wine right before I came over, choosing that Verdicchio because he thought the shape of the bottle was sexy. What he passed off as insouciance that night was something else, caution, uncertainty, maybe even insecurity. But in the moment, I was paying attention to different details, and what caught my eye was a little piece of parchment rolled up and attached to the bottle as decoration. My life was about to become that story, attached to something larger and unspooling in a way that seemed preordained and mysterious, even to me. I mean, wow, Bonnie. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. He was older and he was successful and he was established. And I was very attracted to him. And he had me over for dinner. I was really unsure of myself, but I was quick to think that I was lucky to have the attention of this man. And he invited me over for dinner. He had a pretty confident way about him. So later, I married him, and I was surprised when we talked later to find that that whole thing about pretending that he didn't know if he had a bottle of wine was just a ruse. It was just made up. He had run out and bought wine that day. So he was just acting. And you're not writing a memoir, opportunity to settle scores with people who you think have wronged you. At the beginning, maybe you think that's the opportunity, but that doesn't help the reader at all. That does nothing for the reader. The reader needs to find a story that's as good as a novel, as you said. That's wonderful praise, and something that resonates with them. It's not useful to blow your stack about how people have done wrong. And so I really try to apply a lot of empathy. And so in the moment, he was playing it cool. He was being the cool guy. But later, reflecting, I realized that he was probably scared too. He was trying to impress me too. I didn't see it that way then. I was thinking, oh, did he really, just find this bottle kicking around, or did he go out and buy it? I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking, I am so lucky. This attractive older man is interested in me. I'm so excited. I was paying attention to different details.
But what about the parchment that you were focused on?
That's a bottle of Verdicchio that I don't know if people will still buy or will remember. It's shaped sort of like this. It's beautiful, and it's got this little story attached to it. And I'm just saying that my life became a story that was almost preordained because I was brought up to get married early and to seek out marriage as a destination, because my father had this background. A couple of chapters later, I go into detail about it, as a Hasidic Jew in Poland. And even though he only had 9 years in that life, that way of life was really deep inside him. I mean, I suppose it's a little chauvinistic, but more than that, he thought that's a lovely way to live and that's a safe way to live. And it was a high priority. So that's what I mean by preordained.
They wanted you to be a Sadie married lady.
And even though I'm not super young, it was still a little anachronistic for my age group. My friends weren't quite being brought up that way. And I think that's the European in my dad and those sort of old values he brought. Yes, they wanted me to get married and to be safe and protected that way. But that isn't necessarily where my safety was.
How is your dad reacting now to the book being out?
He's very happy. So he wanted me to write a book about his story. And it's funny that he wanted me to do that, even though he didn't want me to be unhappy. So he didn't quite connect the dots there, that writing a book about his Holocaust experience might make me miserable. He just didn't quite connect that. And if I had ever said that to him, he would have dropped it immediately. But I never did. And he never thought about it that way. So I carried this responsibility. You know, I was the writer in the family to write my dad's story. And of course, I could not write my dad's story because I was phobic about the Holocaust. And then when we went to Warsaw, and I had this wonderful bowl of borscht, and I wasn't even a borscht lover, by the way, but it spoke to me, and I came home and something had shifted and I felt different. And I realized that I could write a memoir. Instead of writing his story, a biography, I could write a memoir about what it feels to be the child of this person and all these other struggles. And that really opened the creative door for me.
You know, you're writing about food and how it ties into the events. Like, for example, when you're in Warsaw and the borscht, I mean, it made me think of my dad has Alzheimer's, but like borscht was always his favorite, soup. And cholent, I would grow up, my grandmother would pass it through the window. So it just made me think of all these fond memories of childhood. But of course, a lot of it was also connected to the deprivation that your dad had dealt with, that, in a way, being the daughter of someone who starved and then kind of finding solace in food and food preparation and knowing that you have the means to have the food and to be able to provide the food. That is a big deal. And I know your dad didn't want you to be in the restaurant business because he did not see that. He just saw it as something he did to help support his family, and he enjoyed it, but he didn't want you to have to get up at like 5:30 in the morning, although writers often do. I don't, but writers do.
Not easy enough and not glamorous enough. Now he understands me better. I mean, the really beautiful thing about this whole experience is that I didn't write the book that he wanted me to write. I wrote the book that I had inside. And he has so much respect. I mean, I wrote it right into the book. So much respect for it. He understands. He understands that easy isn't always the best thing for me. I want to do hard things and I want to sink my teeth into challenges. And I have gained understanding. I wasn't really expecting that. I was just writing my truth, but I have gained understanding from him.
Now, when I read your book, it's so visual. And I mean, the food itself, you could just imagine that on film, because you're always interested in doing the next thing, the hard things. Do you have a vision of it being a movie?
I do actually, and I would do it quite differently because there was an alternate way that I could have structured the book that I realized wasn't the food way. I like to try hard things, so maybe I'll try it. I don't know. I want to get started on another book, actually.
Would the next book be a memoir as well, or would it be a novel?
I think it would be a novel.
Very common. People go from memoir to novel. I think memoir is excruciatingly difficult to do. I'm working on one now. I think it's very hard. So
Is hard. I mean, I don't know if a novel it will be an autobiographical novel for sure, but about different aspects of life. So naive to say I think it's going to be easier. It probably won't be, but I mean, this was super gratifying. It was very hard, but it was really gratifying. So,
and it's really getting such accolades. What do you want people to come away from reading your book with?
of course, I want people to remember the Holocaust and to not forget these people and to think of my own family, my own grandmother. I sort of go down the rabbit hole trying to sort of conjure her to remember what happened to these people and to imagine that they didn't die with nobody sort of marking that. But more broadly, I really want people to connect with their own food memories. Food is identity, food is memory, food is connection. As I said earlier in our chat, I really delight in hearing about people from different cultures connecting with both the trauma part of it, trauma is universal also, and the food part of it, and also the search for self, which is worth it. I didn't get to this until I was in my 50s, but it's worth it. I wish I would have done it sooner, but that's okay. It took as long as it took.
And is your dad going to do any of the events with you?
You know what? He's a little too old. We'd made a podcast together while I was in progress with the book, and he recounted his whole story. And he and I both were like sick for 2 weeks after. I mean, we talk about it all the time, but that amount of detail, it was very hard on him. So we decided that he was not going to do any media. He did a little clip. We did an NPR. It was on NPR itself with Scott Simon. And in order to involve him, I recorded him talking about his moment of liberation. And that is inside the NPR clip, which is really nice, but it's too much pressure for him. He's 94. Is he going to misspeak? Like, I don't want him to have stress over that.
Yeah.
He's cognitively totally there, but he doesn't hear that well. He doesn't see that well.
Yeah, I think that's a good decision. Well, this has just been so great. And any final advice for writers who are trying painstakingly to write their story?
I would say you have to keep the reader in mind. So you start thinking that it's about you, and it is at first, but then you have to find a way to transcend that barrier and imagine the reader's experience. You're writing into your pain or your trauma or the things that you need to. And I think that's great as a start. But then you have to look at it critically and say, what does this mean to the reader? What can the reader gain from this? And I think that that's a really important step that is not always discussed for memoirists.
Brilliant. Bonny, this has been such a pleasurable conversation about such an important topic, how to share an egg. Everyone needs to read this. Everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I loved it. It was so nice to talk to you.
Follow me at estelleserasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.